It's been 2 months since the devastating floods in KwaZulu-Natal and the province struggling to repair the damage. Now, researchers are hard at work trying to isolate the cause of the damage. Many believe that climate change is responsible for the heavy rains, but there are also concerns that the human settlement and human development is also exacerbating the problem. Well, let's get more perspective on this now, and we're joined by Professor Emeritus of the Hydrology Department at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Roland. Schulze speaks to us now. Prof, good morning to you. You are arguing that there is a human factor that has played the role in the floods that we have seen in KZN in April. Detail that for us, please.
Yes, good morning, Collie. You're quite correct. We did have a very severe flood. I mean, we had up to 311 millimeters on a single day, and that was falling on a saturated soil. So it was a major event. But the flooding was both, in a way, controlled and uncontrolled. Remember also all the damage done. I mean, we had 13,500 houses damaged, 6,000 plus people homeless, 125 schools damaged. We are told that the damage in total is 17 billion rand. Cell phone towers and all sorts of things were damaged, and we lost 450 plus lives. Yes. The immediate reaction from government officials was that unequivocally climate change played a role.
Yeah.
But I believe this was not entirely backed up by science. In a way, people are jumping on the climate change bandwagon. It's very nice to say, well, climate change did this and climate change did that. But we're ignoring, on the one hand, the history of flooding and heavy rains in KZN. Just by the way, again, internationally, in South Africa, the worst flood we've ever had was Des Moines in the 1980s, when we had 300 millimeters of rain across 70,000 square kilometers of the country.
And was that in a matter of days, Prof?
That was in a matter of 2 days again. But again, if you look at the worst flood we've had, Des Moines, it doesn't even rank in the top 100 worldwide. It's around about 102 internationally.
Yeah.
However, that doesn't take away from the very, very severe flood that we have had. Now, to your question, the human impact. Please remember that for the same amount of rainfall we have now versus, let's say, 100 years ago, we have a high degree of formal urbanization. Now, formal urbanization means the surface is tarred or cemented. It is what we call impervious, and therefore the runoff is very high. We also have, from a human perspective in KZN, but elsewhere in South Africa, some quite complicated spatial planning, because on the one hand we have municipal planning, on the other hand we have traditional laws, and these are not always aligned.
Yeah.
What we have also in KZN and elsewhere, and that was brought out by these floods, is where do you build and where do you not build? We have a lot of in-migrants coming, which we didn't have 50 years ago. Some of these are legal, some of them are illegal, some of them are South African, some of them are foreign. Where do these in-migrants go? And this is, again, the human element.
Yeah.
They go where they can find a space to build their shack, which is very often on the floodplain. Now, God made floodplains to be flooded, and so even if the floodplain doesn't get flooded for 10 years or so, at some stage it will be flooded, and this is where the people have moved into in the case of Durban.
Yeah.
And the other place where they have moved to, again legally or illegally, that's not for me to say, is on steep slopes, and many of these steep slopes have unstable soils, and when they build their houses they do not have the deep foundations which one has, for instance, in suburbia. So these are some of the human issues that we have to deal with. A lack of planning, in-migration, population explosions, and then we have a big flood coming on top of that.
Well,
but please remember...
Yes, Professor. In fact, if I could squeeze in this question.
Please, yes.
Still on the element of human factors, how big a role did the logged or the clogged up, that's how I should put it, the clogged up drainage systems, how big a contributing factor was that?
A very major contributing factor. If one looks at many of the photographs of the floods, one will see that there is, on the one hand, what we call alien riparian vegetation. This is now vegetation that is not natural, that springs up in the floodplain, and this has shallow roots on the river banks. As soon as you have a flood, this is ripped out, and so we have not controlled the so-called alien riparian or riverine vegetation. And that has caused a lot of blockage of culverts. Then please remember, very often in these areas we have a throwaway society. Solid waste caused a lot of blockage.
But then whose responsibility is it, Professor, to clear those blocked drainage systems? I mean, I think it was last week when the floods hit the Western Cape. I was listening to the mayor there of Cape Town, Jordan Hill Lewis, and you could tell that he was speaking with a certain measure of confidence because his backyard, he says, the drainage systems are relatively well kept, and so we don't have much to worry about really, but of course it's those areas that are on floodplains that obviously would be affected. Who's at fault for not maintaining and making sure that these drainage systems are cleared?
At large, because society at large is who's throwing away the things into the drainage that causes the blockage. That's the one side. It's us human beings, the people who live there. They have a responsibility, but your question really is it the municipality's responsibility? Yes, it is. They have to make sure, especially in the season of flooding, which in the Western Cape is in winter, and which in KZN is in summer and late summer. They have a responsibility to keep the drains clear. But don't forget, it's us human beings who are throwing the things into the drains that cause the blockage.
I can almost hear the politicians saying, the apportioning of blame, can we move on from that now? Well, which is what we're going to do exactly. And so this is the opportunity for KZN, and particularly the worst affected areas, Professor, to try and rebuild. As they build anew, what is it that they can do to make sure that the environment is able to withstand what you have said is the bandwagon of climate change?
In my belief, there are 4 issues at stake here. The first one is engineering. We need to make sure that our culverts and our drains are engineered to withstand these big floods, the 1 in a 100-year flood. And please remember, in climate change, the theory tells us that the 1 in a 100-year flood now will become much more frequent in future. So there is the engineering aspect that has to be looked at, and there's some quite innovative ways of keeping the material from blocking the drains. Then, secondly, there are environmental factors. I've already mentioned the alien vegetation, and the other environmental factor is that many of these areas are quite eroded, and so there's a lot of silt in the rivers, and that causes blockage as well. Then we have society as the third factor. We're a throwaway society, as I've already said. And then lastly, and this is where I would fit in personally, we have the scientific aspect. We need to redesign our structures to accommodate climate change. Climate change theory tells us we will have more extreme events, and they will become more intense than what we have had so far.
I can't let you go, Professor, without asking this critical question. and I suppose it is perhaps presumption on my part, but I think I've heard a number of people saying that coastal areas are likely to be more affected with the climate change situation. So how vulnerable are those coastal areas?
I go along with that the coastal areas are likely to be more affected because we have things like tropical cyclones and cut-off lows, which with climate change are going to move further south. So the big tropical cyclones that hit Mozambique, for example, are likely in future to come further south and damage Mpumalanga, KZN, and maybe even the Eastern Cape. So yes. And in the inland of the country, it is thunderstorms that may become more intense and cause more damage there.
Professor Roland Schulze, thank you very much for your insights on this very, very important matter. He is a Professor Emeritus of Hydrology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal.